Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm incredibly excited to be here. Definitely want to first thank this law firm we're at, Schultz, Roth, and Zabel, for hosting us today. Really grateful for them and their hospitality. And I'm super excited to have this conversation and talk about space and politics and climate and Earth and lots of things. We'll see where this conversation goes. So would love to start with just brief introductions. And Olivier and Christina, just to remind you, you might be on mute. So let's come off. Olivier, would love if you could just start and give us a brief introduction on yourself and maybe touch on anything specifically about your background related to climate or space.
Right. Hi, Scott. Hi, Sara. Hi, Christina. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well? I think we checked, but I think it should be okay. Right. Okay. Well, look, I'm in Paris and the weather is beautiful. So I invite you all to come to Paris instead. Mondays in Paris are much more enjoyable anyway. Just to say, I think, Scott, you asked me to start because I have a delightful French accent. So I will not hide it any longer. Yes, I'm definitely French. I used to be a career diplomat in the French Foreign Ministry after studying at the National School of Government. And after 9 years in the Foreign Ministry, I became a political appointee and I became diplomatic advisor to the French president at that time, Nicolas Sarkozy. So it was from 2007 until 2012. During that time, I was lucky enough to deal with the rest of the world with the financial crisis in 2008. And I have many stories about it, by the way. And also, we had the Copenhagen summit in 2009 about climate change, which remains in history, not for the good things, but should be actually revisited because the agreement we had at that time makes up for about 95% of the Paris Treaty that was signed some years later under the capable engineering of the French diplomacy. And I will not comment on anything regarding Denmark. So, so I was working also, I have been involved in all the summits at the time, G8, G20, and all the likes, and the United Nations, of course. So after that, I moved on to the private sector and I joined a bank, which is not very exotic. And after working a number of years in the bank, I decided to create my own business. This is where we are.
Thank you so much, Olivier. And we won't hold it against you for being French, at least that much, just a little bit. Appreciate it so much for joining. Yeah. Christina, I believe you're in London. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I'm Christina Korp, and I am known as the Astronaut Wrangler because I used to manage Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon with Neil Armstrong. And this job was not the plan for my life. I was a professional singer for a long time and toured all over the world. And then I ran a small record label and production company. And then I took this job to work with Buzz to have a quiet, boring life for a little while. And it set me on this this pathway to purpose that was really unexpected for me. I thought it was something I would only do for a year or two, but being welcomed into the world of the Apollo astronauts and being accepted in that world as well really made me the fly on the wall of their lives. And so getting to see these incredible humans who were a part of something that changed the world and the way that it inspired the world in a way that we haven't really seen since. I always say that Apollo 11 and the first moon landing is arguably the only positive thing that happened on Earth that the whole world united in a positive way to celebrate something that humans did. And so what I began to learn about the Apollo missions is how much space is intertwined in our lives. And as you see over my shoulder, I have the very iconic Earthrise photo. And this was actually taken from Apollo 8, the first mission to orbit the Earth. And what a lot of people don't know is that these Apollo missions are actually what started Earth Day. and what started the Environmental Protection Agency, because it was the first time that humans had seen the world this way. See this, blue marble floating in the blackness of space and realizing how precious our planet is. So that really started a movement of environmentalism that, of course, carries on today, but a lot of people don't realize that it came from the Apollo missions. And then beyond that, over the years of running Buzz's company, which turned into a dozen years of running his company and his education foundation, which I launched, Share Space and the Aldrin Foundation, I started also meeting the female pioneers in space. The first woman to work in mission control in Johnson Space Center, the first woman to work at Kennedy Space Center, all the first female, astronauts at NASA. And I started realizing that I had an opportunity here to highlight the women, because even female astronauts don't get asked to do as many talks or to be asked even on panels and stuff like this at the UN as much as the guys do. And so I thought maybe I could use this access and this relationships that I've gained to really raise awareness about those women, and then how we all have this shared purpose to raise awareness about the ways that space exploration benefits life on Earth. A lot of people think about space as this faraway place that has nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, everyone is using a smartphone that is utilizing, satellites in orbit. And, even that sometimes people, don't think is a big deal. And I'll just say, do you use GPS? Then you're using space technology, and this is pretty much every day. So beyond that, we really want to try to get people, though, to understand that, if they care about climate and environment and things like that related to the SDGs, that the things that we've developed in space are really the tools that we should and could be using to take better care of our planet, and that could solve the SDGs. So this is what has brought me here to be part of this panel, as well as because we want to try to get people to understand the ways that they could be using space technology for climate, environment, saving animals, just making life better for all life on Earth. So thank you for having me here today, Scott. I appreciate you including me in the conversation.
Of course. Thank you so much, Christina. Grateful to have you, and also incredibly excited about space as a potential to solve all of our world challenges. Last but not least, I'm pleased to have Sara Sabry joining us as well. Sara, do you just want to give a little background about yourself and space?
Of course. Thank you, Scott, and thank you. It was so great to see you, Olivier and Christina. Always great to see you, Christina. Christina and I travel a lot and we do space camps, and she's an incredible human being, so I'm very grateful to call her a space sister. So my name is Sara Sabry. I am the first Egyptian and first Arab woman and first African woman to go to space. And it's been a crazy journey, and how it started was my journey into space was not something that I had dreamed about as a child, because where I grew up in Egypt. I was born in Saudi Arabia. We're not really allowed to dream about these things. So I'm trained as an engineer, studied mechanical engineering, then biomedical engineering masters, and now I'm doing my PhD in aerospace. So it's always been about solving problems. And these problems shifted between, solving the problems from the world around us. How do you make it easier for people around you? That was through mechanical engineering. So I worked on Formula 3 cars for a little bit, worked on, shifted a little bit to cancer research for some while. And then I decided that I wanted to apply the problem-solving skills that we learn in engineering into the medical field. So it was all about, again, trying to solve problems in the field, trying to solve problems for humans and their health. And for me, I always, as a child, dreamed about if I died, and at least I saved one person in my life, then that would be it. That was always the goal for me. So it wasn't really related to space. It wasn't related to any of that, but it was always about problems, and that needed to be solving and taking responsibility towards that. So doing biomedical engineering, working in stem cells, working in robotic surgery, it was always, again, trying to solve problems with different ways. So tackling them through robotic surgery, how do you avoid making errors? Let's say, how do you increase autonomy? So I worked on AI and robotic surgery to increase autonomy for a partial nephrectomy, so moving a tumor from a kidney. And also in stem cells, same thing, always, again, solving problems. And then something happened in my life where I was going through a very big existential crisis. And I had a lot of questions. I really wanted to understand everything around us. And again, problems around us. So it's always revolved around that. And wanting to, this urge of wanting to understand our origins and our future and all of that led to the space field, because through space and through having that understanding and really being able to, understand and solve the problems that we have there, we're going to be able to understand us being human more. So that's how it all started for me. It wasn't about me going at first, but it was more about having an understanding. And this thing that was developed inside of me where I can't just, I couldn't let it go. And I decided that, okay, so like, what do we need to do here? And I got more involved into astrophysics. And in that field, it led me to actually thinking about, okay, maybe me going would help. So what can I do there? How can I use my biomedical engineering skills and my mechanical engineering skills to help? And I did exactly that. And through wanting to do research, when I was doing research on spacesuits, while working in Berlin, I worked on augmented reality for a little bit. So again, it's very, very broad. And then while working on that, and wanting to get involved in the field, I saw how inaccessible it was. And I think that's something that we're going to cover today a little bit and talk about why it's so inaccessible and what we can do about it. And because of where I'm from and because of my passport, it's really limiting of what you can or can't do, or you're allowed or what you're not allowed to do in the space field, which for me, of someone who was not involved in the space field at the beginning, it was really strange and it didn't really make sense. Like, how is something so big and so vast very limited? And I think that was the thing that clicked inside of me, where like, how this is one of the reasons why we're not able to progress, why we're not having that understanding that we should be having about ourselves, about the world around us, because those are the big questions that we're asking. And that's why I founded a company called Deep Space Initiative. And what we do is we do exactly that. We're working on increasing access to the space field by providing opportunities in research and education, and also working on those laws that make it so inaccessible. And our whole idea is to delete those borders on the map, because when you go to space, when we see Earth from space, there are no borders on the map. These are just drawn. You will never see them on the real map, like on the real like Earth, on the globe. And it's just on maps that are drawn, or like, of course, like made 3D and stuff, but so they don't exist. And it's just these lines that on the map that have been created by men centuries ago in a room, that have separated countries, have separated families, have dictated what you can and cannot do as a human being in the world, and has created such such inequalities. I think that was a big thing where space field is really, really helpful for. So I think there are so many things that are interconnected. And since going to space, I got selected last year to go to space through a program called Citizen Astronaut Program. And it's the first program of its kind that selects people that is not the government that selects astronauts. So it's the only one that exists. And we are only 2 citizen astronauts in the world, which is really exciting. We're going to have a 3rd one soon, which is really, really exciting. And since coming back, I've realized that, again, there are so many problems that need to be worked on. And going to space and seeing Earth and really realizing the role that you can play, or that you need to be playing in the world, it shifts a little bit what priorities you give to. And I think we're going to talk about that too, because I know like I took a lot of time to introduce, but like we can talk about that as well.
This is why we're here, is to learn and hear your experiences, because you had such a unique path. I mean, no one else has had your path, right? And so I love hearing your story and your drive and motivations to do all the incredible things you're currently doing. And you mentioned the shift. There's an effect called the overview effect that typically astronauts have, where it's sort of a cognitive, psychological effect of viewing the Earth from a different way than almost any other person has. And you sort of started, but share a little bit more deeply, like, how is that going up into space and seeing Earth, seeing how little we are and insignificant in some ways, like, how has that shifted your life and your views on the planet?
It was a lot more profound than I thought it was going to be honest. So I've heard about this overview effect for a while. I've heard astronauts talk about it, but because, like you're saying, Scott, like I was the first one and the only one from that side of the world. Like I know it's not good to say like this side or that side or them and us and things like this, but it's the truth. Like I was the first one from who has grown up in places where it wasn't, you know, I never really grew up with opportunities in front of me, and it was very, very different. And when you grow up in a place where you're constantly fighting to delete those borders on the map, it also comes with a different, like you come in with a different perspective, with different, you know, priorities, or different like fights that you fought. It's very, very different. And I think it's when I went, it wasn't what I expected it to be. I didn't think that it would change me that much, and I didn't think that I would be involved in what I'm involved in now, or not being, let's put it in a good way, just to be politically correct. It's to not be as scared as I would be before to get involved in the things that I'm involved in now, because there's a lot of things that you, especially as a woman coming from where I come from, there's a lot of things that we're not allowed to talk about, that we're not allowed to, you know, you just can't, you know, we don't have freedom of speech, we don't have all of that. So it's a risk that you have to take. And I think I am a lot more willing to take those risks than I used to be before. I'm a lot more eager to solve the bigger problems and to make the bigger sacrifices as well, because when you want to deal with the big problems, like with climate change, with human rights, with things like this, it's much bigger than, you know, one person can handle, and it's an effort that we all need to be putting in together. But I think before going to space, I thought that's okay, I need to be solving the technical problems because I'm an engineer and I wanted to kind of solve those ones. But now I've become a lot more involved in activism, in things like changing policy. I sit with lawyers more than I sit with engineers. And it's completely shifted how, you know, my life has come to. And I never really thought that I would need to be learning so much about laws and policy. This is not something that I had planned, you know, or had ever thought that I would be involved in. I never thought that I would be needing to sit with all of these politicians and really learn about how this new language, you know, it's a completely new language that you have to learn. I come from an engineering background, so it's easier for me to, you know, work with engineers, and like this is comfortable. And then with entrepreneurship, I have founded several companies, and I'm leading a company. So running a business as well, I think that was something to learn, and it was not too difficult to learn that language for me. But so that was another language that you have to learn, and it's a whole other thing. Like it's a whole other way of you know, of dealing with things. But then with politics and that other side, with law and politics and policy, it's a whole other language, and it's so different from the entrepreneurship and business world, and it's so different from the engineering and technical world. So it's a new adaptation, and I think you can either resist wanting to get involved, or you can just go in it and just kind of immerse yourself. And that's what if you really want to have to create change, unfortunately, it is in the policy world a lot more, because we have the technologies, we have a lot that are available to be used, but a lot of, you know, the communication between technical, you know, between the technical side, between the business side, there needs to be a little bit more communication, and how do we help each other make it into the real world? So let's say if you have a technology, how do you commercialize that? How do you make it economically viable? How do you market it? So all of that side, which is I think really, really important, but then how do you make it important for policymakers to be able to apply? How do you convince them to give that importance? How do you change to change the law? How do you pass it to Congress? Like all of that are specific steps that you need to take that is not easy to learn. You face a lot of resistance. I have faced so much resistance in Egypt, and of course, like I think we face resistance everywhere. And it's because it's difficult. People don't like the word innovation means change means like changing something that's already been established. And when you realize that definition, resistance is going to come with it. It's just normal. But also expecting that helps you, because then you know how to deal with it. So it's been an incredible journey. And I think going to space has what has pushed me to do that. And of course, on the personal side, it has changed, of course, the scale of everything that you see. You know, seeing Earth from space is just the most beautiful thing that any of us can see with our own eyes. And the first thing that I said when I came back, and I have committed my life to, is that everyone needs to see this. So before I die, I have committed that, like, I will do everything that I can to at least help in giving everyone the choice to make that that choice to make. So that you can say, like, if you want to see Earth from space, you get that choice. And it's not dependent on where you're from or your resources.
It's amazing. I love hearing how your perspective has changed. And I think focusing on sort of the future generations' perspective is going to drive that forward and make it possible. Christina, I know you do a lot of work in sort of that intersection of education and space. What are some ways that you're working to scale these education programs and get young people excited about space as an industry and as an opportunity?
So as Sara mentioned, I've been doing a lot of space camps all over the world with astronauts. I have a very unique access and opportunity to bring astronauts with me all over the world. And so for the most part, I will say it's mostly with the Space Sisters, like with the female astronauts that I work with. And we're trying to do it in a way that, frankly, is not technical. We're very committed to doing very creative ways of inviting people in to space, because there is definitely this this perception that you have to be a genius to work in space, that you have to be some scientific or mathematical genius. And I'm here to tell you that that is simply not true. And I know this because I know a lot of astronauts and I know a lot of people. And don't get me wrong, I know we have this, we need the rocket scientists and the engineers, but we need pretty much everybody on Earth working in some way in space. And so I always say, every job we have on Earth, we will need in space. As we go back to the moon, which is very in the near term, we're sending humans to the moon next year, an Artemis 2 mission, NASA's mission, in 33 nations. Germany just signed the Artemis Accords. And so what I'm trying to do is make space accessible through very creative projects. I'm here in London with Nicole Stott, a NASA astronaut, and we're doing a project with Harwell Campus, which is a very scientific area, scientific research facility where they do quantum and health and space and other things. And it's a very, very close-knit group of people that isn't very well known, but they want to expand awareness about it because they're investing billions of dollars into this facility and they need people to come and work there. And so we're doing this project that's kind of a public awareness project. So 2 days ago, we took over the London Piccadilly screen and showcased a call to action to create space art, for kids to create space art. And we're going to put that together in a giant mosaic of kids' space art that will be revealed on October 9th during World Space Week. Now, that's one side of things. I'm always saying, it's not just about kids and the education. We cannot forget the inspiration part. And that's the part that I feel is kind of my specialty, of trying to do inspirational projects, because I have been the witness to the impact of the Apollo missions, literally hearing moon landing memories every day for the entire time that I've worked with Apollo astronauts. And so most of the time, actually never do I hear, we saw this mathematical problem and that inspired us to want to be a scientist or engineer. It usually was like, wow, we saw humans land on the moon and we began to believe that we could do, things that seemed impossible in our lives. So this is where, to me, the key is inspiration. But going back to education, education is always focused around kids, but frankly, we need to educate the politicians and adults and people who own companies and people who have influence. And, we were talking about this the other day with Olivier, like a lot of politicians have no idea what their country is doing in space. And they don't really understand the capability that's at their disposal. And that's something that, you know, the astronauts and I are really, really passionate about. When we have the opportunity to possibly get in front of people like Sara said, who make policy, to get them to understand what they have at their disposal or what they should be looking at. You know, I was on a panel at the World Economic Forum in 2020, and it was an innovation panel, and it was a bunch of men who ran, you know, the policy for many different countries, and me. And every single one of them were talking about, oh, we're going to invest in green technology and we're going to do this and that. And everything they mentioned was old space technology. And I just said, wow, you know, you guys need to be looking at what's being developed in space right now, because we're, you know, the people in space are developing things to survive on the moon, and how to have energy and grow food and do all kinds of things in the most extreme environment of space that you should be using here on Earth, cleaning the air, water purifiers, that sort of thing. And so that's where kind of the other part of my mission, like with my foundation, Space for a Better World, is connecting the space curious to the space serious, because I came from the space curious world and I'm deep in the space serious world now. And if I can help be that bridge of education, not just of kids and parents, you know, and families, but hopefully even of people who have influence, to understand that using space for things that benefit many people, and frankly, you know, might be able to accelerate change in positive ways. We were having this discussion too the other day about how Nicole had mentioned, you know, it might be easier in some ways for some third world countries to jump and leapfrog to futuristic space technologies easier than a lot of the Western countries who are so ingrained in the way that their infrastructure is built. And so, and the example we gave was like, they may be living in some ways in primitive conditions, and yet all of these kids have smartphones using satellites, and the way that they handle their financial transactions. So, you know, there are ways to help make life better in some of those places that might be based in space rather than the traditional, you know, ways of infrastructure. So, so going back, like when we talk about education, that's how we think about it, is in a broad sense, not just about inspiring kids, but hopefully inspiring and educating policymakers, you know, people in leadership.
Yeah, it's everyone. Everyone needs to become space serious, as you said, right? But and the inspiration is important. And we can move a little bit more to the policy side. Olivier, I mean, how do we get policymakers to care enough about space that and get educated enough about space so that they make better choices when it comes to regulating this incredible economic opportunity at minimum, but probably a bigger opportunity in terms of fixing the world's problems?
Well, first of all, I thank Sara and Christina for what they say. It's very inspiring, very interesting. And to be honest, this is very much lacking in the public debate, not only at a global level, but also, I must say, and here I talk as the least knowledgeable guy in this event about space. So I can say that what I heard during my time in government, and especially at the highest level in the G7 country and the P5 country, that is France, is everything but knowledge about space, right? So the thing we know are the things that we remember from Cold War, and also the money that we have to spend on the different programs in order to continue launching satellites. But obviously, it's not going any further than that. And I should say this is damageable because obviously, as you know, people with scientific background are not very much present in the top levels of decision making in politics, probably because they are discouraged very early on. As soon as they understand that most of the decisions made at the highest levels are everything but rational, which of course is very disturbing. It's disturbing even for non-scientific people. I can tell you, I guarantee. But it's especially, I think it's particularly disturbing for people with a scientific background. as much as you know that when you present a case and that a lot of the arguments are just being rejected only on some grounds that you may not understand, only because they are purely political. And you know how I am not bashing elected people, because I know how difficult it is to be elected, and I know how you must be accountable to your constituency, and the constituency doesn't talk to you much about space, to be honest. But having said that, there's always a reason, a political reason, to avoid talking about a major issue. And this is what I have seen most of the time. But more importantly, one thing that I wanted to come back to is something that struck me in the last 20 years, and I think it strikes everyone. You see that 20 years ago, the United Nations was able to launch a vast program of Millennium Development Goals. And this was the time when the United Nations would still be able to launch very, global, by sense, debates that would irrigate public debates all around the world. Where are the United Nations today? Where are they? Where is the leadership? What are the issues that are being under discussion? I mean, MDGs were very political in nature. SDGs are absolutely technocratic. If there's anyone here listening to what we are talking about or present in the room who can talk in detail about the SDGs, I clap and I say bravo, because it's becoming absolutely nonsense. So we are not seeing any leadership from the United Nations, I'm afraid to say. This is a question that I personally have discussed with the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and his view was that the reason mainly was because there is no global positive leadership in the world anymore. That means that there used to be presidents coming from various countries who used to be able to take initiatives globally that would make a difference in the world. But who are they today? Only negative leaders. And I measure what I'm saying. I know it's maybe harsh on some leaders who are trying to say and do things positively, but honestly, there is not much that can be told about what's been done in the past few years. Look at what the G20 in India has produced. Clearly, the G20 is something that we created collectively, but I have to say under some pressure of the French at that time. I want to remind you of that. But the G20 was created with a lot of hope, not only to settle and solve crises, but also to serve as a forum to discuss global issues in a permanent way, and inviting also the African Union, and which, by the way, will become member of the G20. But and this forum is now, let's say, not very relevant. That is a big shame, because if there is no such forum able to discuss global issues, and the United Nations is stuck and unable to tackle global issues, where do we discuss them? And this is a point that is only, I would say, political, and I'm afraid I'm taking you very much away from space, but it's a point that needs to be made, because that explains also a lot of the difficulties when you are a political leader somewhere to start talking about this subject, because simply people, they never hear of it. It's not in the agenda.
That makes sense, and it's actually, it is right on topic, and regardless of the teeth, if you will, or impact right now that the G20 is having the African Union join as part of it is a big step, because there's clearly underrepresentation when it comes to the global South in these global meetings. And so,
Scott,
Sarah,
on this, very importantly, I think the world governance obviously should change. We have been trying to change it over the past 20 years. It's very difficult. The United Nations is a victim of it, also, of course, because of the Security Council, that obviously cannot be reformed. But regarding space, I have rechecked the parties to the founding treaty on outer space, which is from 1967. And if you look at the map of the parties to the treaty, you would see that 114 countries have signed and ratified the Treaty on Outer Space. And it's no coincidence that most of the countries that are not parties to it are African countries. And it's something that maybe if today we started a campaign to promote the signature and ratification of that treaty by all the possible countries in the world, 193 or 4 countries in the world, that would be a big step forward in terms of governance, but also in terms of taking into account anything that African countries, for example, would be then allowed to say when it comes to discussing space.
Definitely. No, I think that inclusivity, especially of Africa, is incredibly important. Sarah,
I'd like to add real quick too, by the way, that China has not signed it either. And the reason that matters is because China has a long-term plan to go to the moon, to mine the ice, to create fuel depots on the moon. And there has been much discussion about they're not beholden to that treaty. And the whole point of the treaty was the peaceful use of outer space. Nobody owns things in space. And so it's become a worry for a lot of the Western world because we don't know what they're doing. And, when Chinese go to space, and not to create a division, but literally they do rocket launches. We have no idea what they're doing. And they end up having lots of space debris, or they have things come back to Earth. There's no notice, like if it falls someplace that could, hurt people. But even what their plans are to go to the moon, we've tried to instill upon people that the reason that this treaty was in place is so that we as humanity, as we go out back to the moon or out in the solar system, that we try to do this as a respectful way of for all humans. But the problem is there are some nations who think, okay, well, if we get to the moon first and we mine it first and we own these pieces of the moon first, then it starts this other territorial issue on another celestial body. So renewing or having a new version of that treaty would actually be really powerful to invite more countries in, like you were saying, Olivier, in a way that I think back then the African continent especially, like, gosh, why would they care about space? But now they're getting interested in space in a way that they haven't been for decades. And like even Sara could actually speak to this a little bit more, because we were talking about doing some things in Africa, in Egypt. And I believe the African Space Agency or the African Space Coalition or something is based there in Egypt, and she knows a lot more about that than I do.
Yes, sir. Do you want to comment? And specifically, let's talk a little bit more about the accessibility issues and challenges with space in terms of who can and can't do what. It may be helpful as well to talk about like ITAR. There's some very strict specific regulations. Maybe even start with what 1 or 2 of those are, and then how you're working to address change within your organization, Deep Space Initiative.
Of course. So with ITAR, this is related to the laws that exist in the US that stop international collaboration, that stop US companies from hiring internationals. And these are based on the fact that all the technologies related to space, satellites, spacesuits, all of them are under something that we call the US munition list. And they have been put there a long time ago during the Cold War, where it used to make sense to have them there because the US wanted to win against the USSR at the time. But now it's really inhibiting both sides. It's inhibiting the field globally. So it's no longer about who gets there first. And yes, I completely agree about the Outer Space Treaty that needs to be updated. There is so much written there that is so vague, that it's written in a way that's like, if you read it yourself, you try to understand it, you can understand it. But the thing is, you can interpret it the way you want to interpret it. So you see different countries taking away some pieces of it and being like, okay, this is how we understand it, so this is how we're going to apply it in the country. And it comes like what you were saying, Olivier, that's very true, that policymakers are sometimes just not understanding like a few the specifics of the technology, and to make the decisions. I completely agree with what you said. It's a very difficult position to be in, to make decisions for a country, to make decisions that have global effects. And it's a really difficult situation. And honestly, I've thought about it a lot. I've written a few articles about this, to be honest, about ITAR, about international collaboration. And we're working on several of these problems with my company that I can explain a little bit about. So when you actually try to understand and try to find solutions, it is really difficult. There is no right and wrong answer. There is the problem where the language, how it's written, is really complicated. With ITAR, no one understands really ITAR. So it's really, really complicated. And if you try to understand it, you're gonna that's why lawyers that are specialized in ITAR are probably one of the most expensive, just because it's so difficult to understand, and the liability of making one small mistake is so grave that no one wants to deal with it. So we deal with that at DSI, and it's been a huge challenge, of course, but I think it's so worth it. And that's why what we do, not a lot of people are doing, just because the consequences are very big. The liability is huge for what we do, but it's really worth it. And I think it's about taking that responsibility of not saying we have the solution. We don't. We don't have a solution, but we have committed to working on it, on bringing the right people on board to work on finding those solutions. And we do it in the technical way. So we do the research, we do the interviews, we gather all the data that is necessary in order to make it easier to understand. So we interpret the laws, you write them down in a way where you also suggest all of the different interpretations that have been taken away from those laws. And then you make it easier for people to understand, and also lay it out in a way that, okay, so these are all the problems that we have. So we have a 4-year plan at DSI. We've just finished year 1, and we're on track. We're going to be presenting a paper very soon, in a couple of months, about one of the solutions that you can provide to combat that. So, and it's not even a final thing. It's just to kind of start this. And what we did was we interviewed so many different experts and people who have been influenced by these laws in the US. And not only on the level where you are influenced by it on, the wanting to do the work, but also the people who are trying to hire. A lot of startups are just really having a lot of difficulties hiring people. They're really having a lot of difficulties with, the laws that are existing, because it just makes their job so much more difficult. And Diana here in the audience is very knowledgeable in that too. So I suggest we also, speak to her about this too, because she works at Blue Origin, and she has also seen how difficult it is, such a big company, to hire qualified people because of the laws that exist.
So as an example, are you a Lebanese citizen or Egyptian citizen?
I'm an Egyptian citizen.
So could you work
No.
at NASA? I mean, and you've been to space.
Yes. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, and that's the crazy part. It's easier for me to go to space than it is to get a visa to the US. So to get a visa to the US, they have to give me clearance just to come. So they have to do background checks on me because of where I'm from, because I was born in Saudi, because of the work that I do in the field. So it is policy and politics make it really difficult for someone who has an unusual path, who doesn't fit anywhere.
And can we fix it? What are 2 or 3 steps that you're thinking of taking with DSI that can help shift this mindset, shift the policy, shift how people think about ITAR and the regulations?
Of course. So one thing is that, let's say where I'm doing my PhD, I work on spacesuits, which spacesuits are under ITAR. So technically, I'm not even supposed to, it works.
This is being
ways.
Broadcast,
Yeah. No. It's always good. It's all good. So I work on spacesuits at the University of North Dakota, and our research is funded by NASA. So we're the only NASA-funded spacesuit lab in the world. And the thing is, where I work is that if I need to test something specifically myself, on the spacesuit, even if I'm the one who designed it, I'm not allowed to go do it. I need to send someone else in my place, even though I'm the one who designed it. You know, it's kind of weird. Doesn't really make sense.
It seems to create a lot of risk.
It does.
Right? You have the expert who designed it who can't even test it. Like that disjointed risk, and especially in space, I mean, the risks are human life at this point more than in other industries.
That's true. And there are a lot of things that we could do to make it easier, right? Like what we were saying at the beginning here was that we need to understand those laws much better. We need to simplify them. So there is a way for you to work on these things. And similar to what I'm doing is that you break it down into, you need to have an understanding of what ITAR really is, what falls under that, so that you're able to work on it. But the thing is, it's so difficult to do, and it takes a really long time for you to have that understanding, for you to get that clearance. But you can make it easier for companies to do that. You can get clearance. You can make the process easier. There's just no push to make that happen. So the thing is, you can, as an international, sometimes be a contractor for NASA or SpaceX, but it's such a difficult and long and process that no one really wants to deal with that. So what we do at DSI basically is what we're trying to do is create that understanding, really get all the expert opinions from all over the world to talk about it. And we are currently focused in the US because we are a US-based company. So that's where we're starting. But our mission and our impact is not only in the US, because I mean, space is a global effort. It's not the US. So what we're trying to do is basically our main goal is to promote international collaboration and to give those steps. So similar to what the SDGs are supposed to do is to basically break them into actions. And what I do personally, what my mission is that when I speak to higher level policymakers, and what I do is seeing what they have committed to doing, is you break it down and make it so easy that you give them just the action items. Here, this is exactly what you can do. So for instance, when we're talking about those laws here now, and what we do at DSI, now we are proposing a way to, when we're talking about immigration law, that's a whole other thing. When we're talking about international law, that's a whole other thing. So to simplify it is that in the space field, it's related to both. And what we would try to do is that we propose a solution which is similar to having a space visa. How do you make the process so easy and so simple to give clearance to a project, to be able to be collaborated between two countries? How do you make it easier for the communication, for the information to pass between those countries, so that every time we're having a problem, wherever we are, we don't have to start over, or we don't have to wait 7 months to get clearance when the project is, time dependent. Things need to move quickly, especially in the space field. Things need to move really quickly. So you're seeing always that issue of taking a step back, always, and reworking on the problem just because you can't get that information from the other side. So I have seen, and I can't really talk too much about that because it's under clearance, so I can't really talk about what those problems are. But it's I have seen a lot of projects stop, which are really big scale projects that, to be honest, that specific project that's, of course, I can't really go into detail about, could have had such a large impact on the entire nation. And I have seen it stop because of those laws. And it was so disappointing to see, because it could have really changed the economy of that country. And when you think about having like that one little thing that had such big consequences on an entire nation, and there is no communication, because again, like what I'm doing now, I'm not even allowed to talk about. So that's why it's a problem that we need to be more transparent about it. We need to be more honest about the problems that exist, and that's okay. Maybe we need to say that, oh, wait, like maybe what is going on here is not the right thing. But the problem is, because sometimes these parties cannot talk about it, then there is no spotlight on the actual problem that is there. So no one is really working on it. So you see how like it's always a loop. And it's the problem is those who do have this information, and like Olivier was saying, is that when you do have this information, when you do go up to the policymakers to try to push things, it's really difficult. And like Olivier was saying again, it is very discouraging, because then you see things shifting in the way that you know, you as like being an expert in something, you see the potential that it could have gone in and the very, very long-term effect that it could have had. And of course, you can't really predict the future, but you can, from the data that you have, make predictions. So you can use, you know, like a certain probability of this happening if this were to happen, right? Like you can. I think you still can do that. And the problem is with a lot of nations that are struggling, and especially when we're talking about Africa, like going back to Africa, I think, because that's a really important topic. Africa is doing amazing things, and they're not being spotlighted enough. They really are doing amazing things, and it's not that I am an optimist, but I'm also a realist. So I do see the problems, but I also like to highlight the good things that are happening, which are not being highlighted. There is so many problems in Africa, but they do deserve a seat at the table, and we really need to make that happen because they have so much to offer. And there is this other side where parties are wanting to get more involved with Africa, which is great. And I see it happening now, and it's really amazing. But we need to help a little bit. What I think Africa needs is the strategy for the long term, not the short term. And I think that's not something that anyone talks about because, again, it's those who are involved in it don't really get the opportunity to talk about that.
Right.
The problem is that because Africa has a lot of problems, and especially Egypt, the policymakers are always working on the short term. So what can we do now to fix this right now? When the longer term one, which might not be as lucrative right now, might not be as, you know, you're not going to see the results now, but the long term would put it like up in, you know, as one of the most powerful countries.
Yeah.
And a lot of that happens around Africa. But the thing is, I am kind of optimistic about Africa because I have met several leaders there that have given me a lot of hope. And to be honest, the thing is, and we were at the UNGA yesterday at the SDG summit. Yeah. And we've seen a lot of the policymakers speak. We've seen a lot of representation from the different governments and from different countries. And it was something that we also talked about with Diana, like just briefly a few minutes ago. The thing is, there is no clear path to action that we need. And Olivier was saying, and I completely agree with that, is that it's all for show. But then Africa, that has, you know, because it's struggling so much, because, you know, Christina also was saying that it has a lot more, there's so much more potential for it to really jump into solving things. They're so motivated, it's so new. The results that could have come from it are so huge. And we need to help Africa needs help with several countries around Africa. So I can't really speak of all of it because a lot of countries are at very different stages. Some countries are very advanced, some countries are very, very still at the very early stages, but the motivation is there. So what it needs help with is strategy for the long term. Yeah. So they are very capable, so capable. I was just in Togo a few months ago and talking about the projects that are happening related to sustainability and climate. No one knows about it. No one knows how many $1 billion have been invested on these projects related to sustainability.
There's amazing things. I remember yesterday, there was a country that talked about this incredible work around AI they were doing. It's a country you would never expect, right? So it's giving these opportunities and sharing those stories. And there's an incredible amount of excitement on the continent. And so you had talked a little bit about climate. I think space technology as an opportunity to solve climate change is huge because, I mean, the space missions are the closest thing I can think of to a truly circular economy. Like in space, on a space mission, there's no such thing as garbage, right? Everything is looked at as a resource. Like if they can do that in space in an incredibly inhospitable environment, we can use that technology to do the same things on Earth. Why do we have garbage, right? Let's have resources. Olivier, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your work around climate specifically, and how do you think about promoting new technologies that exist now to helping address those challenges and getting policymakers excited about adopting them?
Yeah, Scott, thank you. Well, following what Sara and Christina said a bit earlier, I think the key anyway for climate change, like for any space-related issue, is to create the sort of feeling within countries that these topics are very important, because any policymaker, any politician, they will only look at their re-election. I'm saying that in all full respect for the tough job that it is. But if you look at how global issues have been dealt with in the last 20 years, progress has only been made once either there was a crisis, like in 2008, or when suddenly civil society decided to mobilize and to put on top of the agenda an issue such as climate change. And this changed for climate change, and it's I'm coming back to my experience, but not too long, don't worry. When I started with my president, the French president, in 2007, believe me, climate change for decision makers all over the world was still not an important topic. We failed to even talk about it at the first G8 summit that I attended. It was despite the fact that Angela Merkel herself, who was hosting it, was convinced by this issue already. She was very pro-environment figure, but clearly you could feel in 2007 it was nothing. Then the financial crisis happened, and I think that it changed very much the way that policymakers looked at climate change issues. First, there was a mobilization that became more and more clear in all countries, at least Western countries. But second, suddenly, and that's why I come back to it, Scott, suddenly we looked at it as a possibility for growth. And I think there was an awareness suddenly in all Western countries that our path for potential growth has really become narrower and narrower, and that because all infrastructures which are needed in countries had been already built a long time ago, and so on. So there was the general feeling that facing such a big, huge crisis as the financial crisis in 2008, we were to have a new model of growth. And the climate change issue suddenly became, in the minds of policymakers, something that of a priority, right? Of course, mobilization of NGOs and civil societies was very, very strong and very important. But frankly speaking, and I'm not going to disclose any of the meetings in which I have been for 1 or 2 years before the Copenhagen summit, clearly this is the key, the driver for the most developed countries to suddenly become very interested in climate change. So at the beginning, we failed to mobilize the whole of the international community. And now we also know, looking at the situation since Russia attacked Ukraine, that you see part of the world is looking at the West as if the West was having an idea, some kind of a plot to prevent them from becoming as big as they should be or as they could be. So let's bear in mind that in many developing countries, there is a feeling that climate change is just a trick deployed by Western countries in order to prevent them from developing. And if you look at some of the countries which have no access to energy, which suddenly are not allowed anymore to look at the possibility to use, let's say, coal, their coal mines. In some countries, there are some coal mines, and suddenly this possibility was not given to them to develop their coal mines, which for them was the only possible access to energy. Then how can you really prevent people from thinking that they are not allowed to develop and not allowed to access the sort of level of development that the West has been enjoying for many decades? So this really should be addressed, because I'm afraid that when we talk about space, we also see that there are, I think I looked at it, there are 70 space agencies, right? If under the control of Christina and Sara, 70 space agencies in the world, which is really not more than 1/3 of the countries in the world that have a space agency. And if I'm correct, I think that out of 70, only 16 are able to launch into space. And if you look even more carefully, you see only one African country has the capacity right now. I think it's Kenya to do that. So the sort of divide that you see on the climate change issue is also there as soon as you look at the issue of space, access to space, right? So these are things that we have to take into account, have a more comprehensive approach to the issues. And on board Africa, and Sara said, I think a lot of things are going on in Africa, and I think there might be an incredible step forward made, because as Christina said earlier, they can make a jump directly to the new technologies, access to new technologies, and so on. But we have got to be more inclusive. And this is not what I see, and this is not what I see so far.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olivier, for your thoughts. We need to close up because Sara needs to get to the airport shortly here. I'd love to see if someone in the audience has a question they want to address, and we'll do our best to answer it and then close up so you can get there on time.
I actually have a statement.
Yes.
About sustainable development goals and the push to have space as SDG 18, as what we saw with Space Renaissance and other organizations banding together, making those statements last week. I was actually there and helped with that. How do you suppose, what ought to be an approach, or maybe there are multiple approaches to enabling space as a sustainable development goal? Is that something that is a worthwhile effort? And as an effort, how do you see that fitting in with your goals at Deep Space Initiative? And how do you see that working with existing initiatives within the UN, such as with UNOSA, the Office of Outer Space Affairs?
So the question, in case Olivier and Christina, you can share it, is related to the development of SDG 18, the space SDG, and really how it intersects with other initiatives.
That's a really good question. And the thing is, with space, it touches a lot of the current SDG goals. So already, in order for us to solve some of the SDG goals that exist related to equal education, with the quality of it, with climate change, with all of those. So I can't name all 17 right now, but a lot of them, a significant percentage, can be solved through us developing those technologies for space. So I'm not really super knowledgeable about why we are trying to create that 18th one related to space.
I know why.
Go ahead.
So, well, first of all, every single SDG could be solved through space. This is something that those of us with those people who work at NASA and all the NASA astronauts, and as a matter of fact, the first time I became aware of the SDGs and looked all 17 of them up, I was like, space could solve all of these, or at least contribute to every single one of them. And the UNUSA website, the UN, outer space organization that's under the UN, has on their website how space affects each SDG. And even what they have listed is just a tiny fraction of what we know is possible in space. It's pretty much all related to satellite technology when you look at the UN website. But that's where, again, me and the astronauts and a lot of people in space for a long time have been trying to raise awareness about many, many more ways each of those SDGs could be affected by space. So the movement of SDG 18 is because the people in the space community are starting to realize, wow, we need to start making people aware of what we have at our disposal. And maybe the best use of that is to create SDG 18 in order to get the attention to what the resources that we have in space. And so, you know, space is a very powerful lobby. You know, even though, as Olivier said, only 70 countries have space capabilities or space agencies. The countries that do have space, like the power in space, are the US, or Russia, is the coalition of the European Space Agency. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, everyone on Earth is benefiting from what those nations are putting into orbit or developing for space. And so they have a lot of impact and a lot of influence and a lot of power related to policy and that type of thing. And I mean, in some ways, like big corporations, they can actually move things quicker. You know, a lot of people say to us, you know, what do you think of all these billionaires wanting to go to space? And we're like, thank God for billionaires, because if we wait around for the governments and the policymakers to get up to speed to make change, then it just won't happen. But that being said, so these powerful people, you know, some of the most powerful and most richest people in the world are heavily invested in space. And there's a reason behind that because of what it means technologically and the impact it makes on the planet. So I think finally the space community has begun to realize we need to mobilize, and maybe the best way to make people understand that we're the ones giving the data about climate change. We're the ones giving the data and the information about, you know, the ocean temperatures and the interconnectivity between all of these things is actually the space community providing that information. And most people just don't realize that's who it is. So I think that the space community is starting to realize, okay, wait a minute, maybe we need to start our own SDG to get people to understand that we have these tools. And so that's something that is just a bunch of people in space who are realizing now, okay, maybe this is the best way, is starting SDG 18 to make space really a major focus, instead of just saying, oh, space can touch on each one of these SDGs. Space could be the kind of the umbrella through SDG 18 of all of the SDGs.
Thank you so much, Christina. Really appreciate that. We're going to close up, but really appreciate everyone's time today. Sara, thank you so much for being here. Christina, thank you so much. Olivier, thanks for joining as well. Space has the opportunity to change the world and solve all of our problems. So continue to support it. Thank you so much.